Sophie didn't believe in ghosts until she became an urban explorer. Documenting abandoned places was her passion, but nothing prepared her for what she found in the forbidden sections of the Paris Catacombs in April of 1999. The official tunnels that tourists visit are just a fraction of the 170 miles of underground passages beneath Paris. Sophie had explored the unofficial sections, known as the Deep Network, dozens of times. She knew the unwritten rules: always bring 3 light sources, never go alone, and most importantly, never venture past the red markings that even veteran cataphiles refused to discuss. That spring evening, Sophie and her friend Mark descended through a hidden entrance in the 14th arrondissement. They were filming a documentary about the cataphiles, the urban explorers who regularly visited the underground maze. 3 hours into their expedition, they found something that wasn't on any map, a narrow passage that seemed to have been recently uncovered. "Look at these marks," Mark said, running his fingers along the wall. "Someone's been scratching numbers into the stone." The sequence appeared random: 2197216. Below them, carved much older: "Ils sont encore vivants." They are still alive. Sophie's camera caught a glimpse of movement in the darkness ahead. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Mark shook his head, but switched on the backup light. They found a chamber that shouldn't have existed. Modern items were scattered everywhere: sleeping bags, food wrappers, photographs, but it was the wall that made Sophie's blood run cold. Hundreds of Polaroids were pinned to the limestone, showing people sleeping, eating, living their lives above ground, all taken through windows without their knowledge. Some photos were dated as recently as last week. That's when they heard the singing. It echoed through the tunnels, a children's song in French, but wrong somehow, distorted, as if multiple voices were singing slightly out of sync. Mark's light flickered and died. Then Sophie's main light went out. In the beam of their last flashlight, they saw fresh footprints in the mud. Leading away from the chamber, they ran. The singing followed them, growing louder. Sophie's camera caught glimpses of movement in adjoining tunnels, shadows moving against shadows. At an intersection, Mark stopped suddenly. "This isn't right," he said. "We should have reached the main passage by now." Sophie checked her map. According to it, they were in a section of tunnel that had collapsed in 1945. That's when she noticed the numbers scratched into the walls around them. The same sequence over and over: 2197216. A light appeared ahead, bobbing like a lantern. A voice called out in French,
"Are you lost? We can help you find a way out."
Something about the voice made Sophie's skin crawl. It sounded like multiple people speaking in unison. They found another exit 3 hours later, emerging in a different part of the city. When they developed the film, most of it was blank. But one frame showed something that made Sophie quit urban exploration forever. In the chamber of photographs, a Polaroid of herself and Mark from that very night, sleeping in their beds, dated 3 weeks in the future. The police investigation found the chamber, but all the photographs were gone. They did find one thing: a journal written in different hands, describing a group who had freed themselves from the surface world in the 1970s, retreating to the depth of the catacombs. The last entry was recent, mentioning new recruits coming soon. The sequence of numbers that Sophie and Mark found was eventually decoded. It was a date: September 21st, 1972, 1600 hours. Archives showed that on this date, some students entered the catacombs and never emerged. But every few years, the student IDs would appear in different parts of Paris, each time with a new photo showing them unchanged, unaged, smiling at the camera with empty eyes. Sophie still lives in Paris, but she never takes the metro. Sometimes, on quiet nights, she swears she can hear children's songs drifting up through the storm drains. The songs are always in perfect unison now.
Hej alle insekter, alla små dyr.
They called him the Butcher of Blackwood, though few dared speak his name above a whisper. In the winter of 1975, the small Montana town of Blackwood was rocked by a series of disappearances, all young men between the ages of 18 and 25. The police were baffled. No bodies were ever found. What made the case particularly disturbing wasn't just the disappearances themselves, but the way they happened. Each victim vanished while working the night shift at different local businesses. Security cameras, primitive by today's standards, caught only static-filled glimpses of a tall figure in a butcher's apron, always facing away from the lens. This story was shared by an anonymous person. Their grandfather was the lead detective on the case. He passed away recently, and while cleaning out his attic, they found his personal case files. What they discovered made their blood run cold. The official report stated that 5 young men disappeared that winter, but according to their grandfather's private notes, there was a 6th victim, one that was never reported. His name was James Morrison, and he worked at Caldwell's meat processing plant on the outskirts of town. The difference? James came back. 3 days after his disappearance, James was found wandering along Highway 23, covered in blood that wasn't his own. His clothes were soaked through despite the freezing temperatures, and his eyes had a vacant, glassy look. When questioned, he could only remember fragments of his ordeal. He spoke of a vast underground chamber beneath the abandoned Patterson farm, filled with hooks and chains that rattled in the darkness. He described a man wearing a butcher's apron made of something that wasn't leather. He somehow managed to escape, but couldn't recall the specifics. The most chilling detail in their grandfather's notes wasn't what James said, it was what happened afterward. Around the same time, 5 more young men had disappeared from neighboring towns. Each time, security cameras caught glimpses of 2 figures in butcher's aprons. The final entry in the detective's journal is dated December 24th, 1975. It contains just 3 lines. Interviewed James Morrison again today. His eyes looked different. Noticed his hands, butcher's calluses forming. God help us all. The disappearances stopped as suddenly as they began. James Morrison left town shortly after, and the case went cold. But here's the detail that keeps me awake at night. While going through newspaper archives, I found reports of similar disappearances occurring every 10 years in different small towns across Montana. The last cluster was in 2015. This winter will mark 10 years since the last disappearances, and yesterday I spotted a help wanted ad at the local meat processing plant. The position, night shift manager. The logbook found in the Flannan Isles Lighthouse told only part of the story. 3 men had vanished without a trace: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, leaving behind half-eaten meals and an overturned chair. But what the official reports didn't mention was the last entry in Assistant Keeper Marshall's personal journal, found tucked beneath his mattress months later, December 14th, 1900. The storms have been relentless. Waves crash against the lighthouse with such force that the whole structure trembles. James says he's never seen anything like it in his 15 years of service. The radio's been dead for days. Nothing but static and strange whistling sounds that Donald swears form words if you listen long enough. Last night I saw something in the water. At first, I thought it was debris from a shipwreck, but it moved against the current. James spotted it too, a mass of dark shapes just beneath the surface, circling the lighthouse like sharks. Except sharks don't glow with a sickly green light, and they certainly don't reach up toward windows 60 feet above the water. December 15th, 1900. Donald's behavior is becoming erratic. He spent hours staring into the telescope last night, muttering about lights in the distance where no ships could possibly be. When I took over the watch, I found strange symbols carved into the wooden railing. He claims no memory of making them. The whistling from the radio is getting louder. James finally admitted he hears words too. They're calling our names. December 16th, 1900. Something is wrong with the light. It's beginning to flicker in a pattern none of us programmed. James went up to check the mechanism and came down white as a sheet. He says there's something living in the lens, something that scuttles away when you look directly at it. The shapes in the water are closer now. During my watch, I saw handprints on the outside of the glass, handprints that glowed with that same sickly green light. We're 60 feet above the waves. How's that possible? Donald hasn't spoken all day. He just stands at the window, pressing his hands against the glass as if answering some silent call. James has locked away all the knives. December 17th, 1900. They're singing now, not just through the radio. It's coming from the walls themselves. A chorus of voices in a language that sounds like drowning. Donald understands them. He's been translating in his sleep, speaking in voices that aren't his own. James says we need to keep the light burning no matter what. That's what they want, he keeps saying. They want the light to go out. I think I finally understand. We're not here to keep ships away from the rocks. We're here to keep something else away from the shore. If anyone finds this, don't let the light go out. Don't let them in. They've been waiting for so long, and they're so very hung. The journal ends mid-sentence. When the relief vessel finally reached the lighthouse, they found it completely empty. The only clue was a set of strange markings carved into every surface. Markings that match no known language or script. The official investigation concluded that the men had been swept away by a rogue wave during the storm. They had to explain somehow why all three experienced keepers would leave the lighthouse without their coats in the middle of winter, leaving their half-finished meals on the table. The lighthouse was eventually automated in 1971. The maintenance crew that installed the automated system lasted only one night before quitting, claiming they heard singing coming from the walls and saw handprints appearing on the outside of the windows 60 feet above the crashing waves. To this day, ships passing the Flannan Isles report strange radio interference, a whistling sound that, if you listen carefully, almost sounds like voices calling your name. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, sailors swear they can see shapes moving in the water around the lighthouse, glowing with a sickly green light, waiting for the automated system to finally fail and for the light to go out.